the demand for energy is going to grow, but clearly there are implications not only for emissions of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, but also in terms of local environmental problems.
If you look at some of the global sustainability challenges that we're facing today, all of the indicators, all the numbers are pointing in the wrong direction.
In 2013, Energy Opportunities set out to find the most effective means of moving the world towards a clean energy future.
Government incentives just rot everything up.
22 years is a long time. It will be more than enough time to wipe out fossil fuel-fed internal combustion engines.
You have to be able to set parameters and say, this is when I'm willing to pay this much for energy and this is when I'm not.
Take this idea and do this distributed. You don't have to have it all in one place.
By brainstorming specific subjects around the world in London, Bangkok and New Delhi, we took top energy thinkers, executives and policymakers away from their normal, comfortable talking points to find some truly innovative solutions that could go beyond the roadblocks we currently encounter.
Free public transport, and we'll tax everything else.
Made everyone a carbon shareholder. Gave them a stake in the game.
Dividing India up into 1,000 different microgrids.
Smart environments, whether that's living in a smart house or living in a smart city.
In this programme, we look at the solutions offered and along with our high-level studio audience, choose the best idea for change.
We started off in London in July. We talked about IT. We talked about what we need to see in terms of a breakthrough in IT that would carry us forward, but also help this issue of energy, energy consumption, energy conservation.
The world is changing. We are adding 1 billion people to the middle class over the next 40 years.
It's not going to be incremental emission reductions that are going to carry us through to some type of viable solution. We need to be thinking more about transformative change.
You will use energy tomorrow. And if you employ software to understand how you are wasting energy, I can guarantee to you that you will save money. The shift happens when people understand the immediate value they create by employing more sustainable practices, not to save the world in 20 years or in 30 years, but to save their business tomorrow.
The ICT sector provides us with an opportunity to really dematerialize the economy. If you look at what has happened in music over the last years, a lot of this is consumed through virtual services now. When you take it and add it all up, it has quite an enormous impact. We're talking about, in some cases, 200 times less emissions.
IT itself is consuming energy, and we have growing data centers around the world. And there is a responsibility of the IT industry to take care of that. We can help a lot of organizations through the software we build and the services we create to reduce the amount of energy that they need.
ICT is a game changer. We have embedded mobile broadband sensors on all the buses in Curitiba, and we saw that if the whole bus system now of the city could be 1% more efficient, and if people drove even just 0.1% less, it could be 10 times the CO2 savings.
I think IT is a great industry to be in at this time because we are seeing a lot of new technology evolving, big data, mobility, cloud, but we're also seeing a fabulous challenge of making the world a better place. And when you bring those two together and you're employing the right business models, beautiful things can happen. We've done it with globalization, we've done it with the internet, and this industry will do it again with sustainability.
In London, we brought together Europe's top energy thinkers and asked them how IT could help cut carbon emissions dramatically by 2035. The winning idea put forward a so-called energy WikiLeaks. In other words, consumption and emissions must become public knowledge. Business will use the Internet of Things, connecting all devices to a central network. This clarity of energy use and waste globally will allow for utilities to match supply to demand.
Well, let me just start with the general idea. How feasible is this idea of an Internet of Things that leads to an improvement in consumption patterns.
It's a fascinating idea, and I love the fact that it's called WikiLeaks, because that just challenges the way you think about it as well. But I think it's entirely feasible. In fact, we're already seeing lots of examples, you know, things, almost every device you buy nowadays is connected or connectable. And I think the more you take the information from that, make it available, and allow all those amazing startups that we see in London and everywhere else to start, you know, feeding on that data, you're going to start to see amazing things happen.
How much do we want people to engage with this? Do we want it to happen invisibly, machine to machine, or do we want people to be sat there tweaking, trading their energy, trading their carbon emissions?
The WikiLeaks idea was it all gets taken away from you and somebody else does something, whether you like it or not. It's maybe more challenging. Privacy and all those things may have a part to play in that. But I do think that there's also the active part of it as well. You know, I genuinely want to have an option when I pay for less electricity if I'm able to give it to someone who can use some of my electricity I've stored up overnight, you know, feeding back into the grid, those kind of things. So, you know, there's definitely an option for both.
The donation of data is not even possible, so Data Protection Act really needs to be changed very fast. Also security issues, if you want companies to share data. In the Big Innovation Center, we are working with 13 companies, which we're aiming for them to share data, and they want to share data, but even when they share data, regulation stops us for combining them, and if they can share data, there are lots of security issues involved.
The ownership of data has to be absolutely clear, and you need to have permission to use it. But if you can then persuade people that you're going to give them something, they'll get something by giving you the data, then I think the opportunity to use that data will then snowball from that based on people seeing the benefits that it will bring. And I think that will then open the doors for people to give their data and for it to be used.
Let's wrap up that idea on London. I think we've given you a good sense of how challenging the idea could be to take forward. Let's move on to our next idea. When we were in Thailand, we asked our group to focus a lot more on the ideas related to transport. Transport, as we know, is a significant contributor to the emissions story. And if we can find better ways of moving people around the world, then maybe we can find better ways of reducing the emissions generated from that process.
People like to experience the city as a benign place, you know, as a humane place where you can also have fun. In Asia, the sheer volume of people that will move into urban areas will create challenges. India, for example, 800 million people expected to reach sort of middle-class lifestyles at some point in the next 10, 20 years.
If you look at the year 2011, that is the first year that China's urbanization rate has exceeded 50%. 2 years later, it's expected to reach about 53%. By 2030, the Chinese government wants to increase the size of urban population by another 300 million, the same size as the entire US population.
The problem with that is, as growth takes place and they increase their lifestyle, they consume more energy, more road space, they want access to cars. And this consumption of resources is becoming a challenge because the amount of carbon the atmosphere can absorb is just not endless. So we have to address this issue now and to develop completely new concepts and methodologies to deal with this.
These tiger economies which have been developed in the 20th century, countries like Singapore, South Korea, Japan, are the ones which are nowadays highly urbanized. The kind of challenge China will face will be very different. The scale is very different.
I don't believe in the future we will all stay in our house and just type away on our keyboard in isolation and then log onto the internet and meet some friends. Around me as an individual, you can probably design a more effective experience and a better experience. I want to have better access to information about the journeys that I'm planning. I'd like to know if there is congestion or it's likely to be congested, that I change my route before I get onto that. I want to be able to have a multimodal journey where I can start with a bus, then use the bike, and if it's raining, I might use a taxi. Cities are places where people meet either to trade or to do business, but they also, you've got to remember, raise their families there and want to have a life. So for that, you do need mobility.
In Bangkok, we asked academics, politicians and business leaders to work out how emissions from Asia's transportation sector could be dramatically reduced by 2035. The winning idea was to create a sustainable mass transit system that would be set up through a partnership between the state and the private sector, and the entire infrastructure would be run on clean energy.
In Thailand, they were very excited about the idea that mass transit was going to lead to a much more energy efficient future. Could you just share with us a few bullet points, some ideas maybe about how practicable the whole mass transit idea is as a way of tackling not only moving people from A to B, but also driving down overall emissions?
Different kinds of transport don't cost the consumer the same amount. A car journey versus an airplane journey versus a train journey are not costed the same way based on their emissions. So that's one of the first problems, and a lot of public transport is built so that and the positive externalities to other people like road users aren't really captured through the fare. And there's an imbalance there, and that's what you see in the US when petrol prices are so low compared to on the continent, and why Americans have such giant cars, because there's a big difference in how people are charged for their transport journey. So there needs to be a way to actually try to balance that between emissions and cost and through probably taxation in lots of ways. I think also with regard to building public transport, the governments have to be willing to do it. And there needs to be a commitment across the political spectrum. It's a challenge that we have at the moment to make sure that these are long-term investments, and investors have to have certainty about whether or not those things are actually going to be delivered. So there needs to be sort of a nationwide commitment that this is a good thing in order to really achieve the investment in a quick way and to deliver that. But I think that you also have to have an environment in which people want to go on public transport. So you have to have cities that are structured and places that are structured so you can actually use it. And there's no point in building any kind of public transport unless it's actually going to where people want to go.
What was interesting in the Thai experience was that this was a sort of ground up pressure that was being put on government. But so much of what we see in the developed world is policy led by governments and often appears not to be hugely welcomed sometimes by the grassroots or the general public. They don't embrace the idea and they worry about the cost.
It is a mix of national governments, local governments, and communities, and everyone has a part to play. And having a national government prescribe something, or just having individuals say this is what we want, isn't necessarily going to find the answer. So I think that what you really have to do is have that mixture of the oversight, because that usually is who ends up funding it in most cases. Local governments who can actually define what their communities want, and so the grassroots support of people who demand this. And I think in a lot of developing countries, when you have traffic like that, public transport is desperately needed, and I can understand completely why there's so much demand in places where there's absolute congestion, and if you have to sit for 2 hours on a motorway to get into work.
I was involved in setting up London Overground. We saw growth of 300% in patronage, and what did we do? We made the service reliable and safe. I think if we can invest in a consistent way and deliver reliability and safety and punctuality, then the government policy that supports that will see this migration to a more energy efficient means of transport.
And is rail the most obvious answer, or are there vacuum tubes that we can all be shot through?
I would love to see a vacuum tube, but even looking forward to 2035, I think rail is still a pretty long-term obvious answer.
The last example, India, is a classic example of the energy debate being really based on the Peter Pan principle. If you believe something long enough, it will happen.
When we come back, the discussion moves to India's energy crunch. How can electricity reach all parts of the population? And back in the studio, the argument over renewable energy gets heated.